Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to do something for me right now. I want you to think about the last time life knocked you flat on your back. Not a stumble, not a setback. I mean the kind of fall where you're lying there staring at the ceiling and the silence around you is so loud it becomes a voice. And that voice says, maybe this just isn't for you. Go ahead, take yourself back to that moment. Now imagine that moment happening to you, not once, not twice, but 3 times. 3 times you built something with your bare hands, your blood, your belief. And 3 times the world looked at everything you poured yourself into and said no. 3 times the doors didn't just close, they slammed. 3 times you had to walk back into your life, look the people who believed in you in the eye, and find the words to explain what went wrong, when deep down you didn't fully understand it yourself. Most people don't survive the first fall with their confidence intact. Most people don't come back swinging after the second, but the third. The third failure is where the universe separates the ones who merely wanted it from the ones who were built for it. The man whose story you are about to hear today, he lived all 3 of those moments. He felt the weight of every single one. And there was a night, after that third collapse, where he sat in a room with very little money, a reputation that had taken serious damage, and a dream that most people around him had quietly stopped believing in. Most people in that room would have made a different decision that night. A safer decision. A smaller decision. He didn't. And that decision, that one solitary, defiant, refused to be finished decision, is the reason he is a billionaire today. Not the strategy, not the timing, not the market conditions. The decision to rise one more time. So I need you to lean in, because what you're about to hear isn't just his story. It's a mirror, and somewhere in the reflection, you are going to see yourself. You are going to see your own failures reframed. You're going to see your own setbacks reclassified. And if you're paying attention, really paying attention, you're going to walk out of this room today with something far more valuable than inspiration. You're going to walk out with permission. Permission to fail forward. Permission to fall loudly and rise quietly. Permission to be unfinished, unpolished, and unstoppable. Ladies and gentlemen, listen closely. This is his story. Somewhere along the way, we were handed a lie. It was dressed up nicely, passed down through generations, reinforced in classrooms, whispered by well-meaning people who loved us, and most of us accepted it without question. The lie was simple. Failure is the opposite of success. That if you fail, you are moving away from your destination. That every stumble is a detour, every collapse is a contradiction of your potential, and every loss is evidence that perhaps you were never meant to win in the first place. But here is what the greatest builders, creators, and visionaries in human history all discovered at some point in their journey. Failure is not the opposite of success. It is the currency of success. You cannot purchase the kind of wisdom, resilience, and precision that leads to lasting achievement without spending some time in the valley of things that didn't work. Think about what failure actually does to a person when they refuse to let it define them. It strips away the strategies that were never going to hold. It exposes the weaknesses in the foundation before the entire structure collapses under greater weight. It teaches you things about yourself, about your character, your discipline, your capacity for discomfort, that no season of smooth sailing ever could. Every time this man's venture crumbled, he didn't just lose a business. He gained a level of self-knowledge that no business school on earth could have handed him in a lecture hall. The problem is that most people experience failure and immediately begin interpreting it as a final answer. They treat the closed door as a verdict rather than a redirection. They look at the rubble of what didn't work and see a graveyard, when in reality they are standing in a classroom. The most expensive education you will ever receive is the one life gives you through loss. And the tragedy is that most people drop out right before the lesson is complete. What separated this man from the thousands of others who failed and never recovered was not talent, it was not connections, and it was certainly not luck. It was his fundamental refusal to misread the moment. Every time the ground gave way beneath him, he asked a different question than most people ask. He didn't ask, why is this happening to me? He asked, what is this preparing me for? That single shift in perspective transformed every failure from a punishment into a preparation, from an ending into an education. And that is the first truth you must anchor yourself to before you can fully receive his story. Failure was never his enemy. There is a particular kind of pain that lives in the third failure, not the first, because the first time you fall, you still have the armor of inexperience protecting you. You don't fully understand what you've lost yet. You still have the energy of someone who believes that youth and hunger alone are enough to rebuild. The second failure hurts more, because now you know what the fall feels like. You've tasted the bitterness of starting over, but you also still have something powerful working in your favor. You have the story of someone who got back up once before. You can point to that. You can lean on it. But the third time is different in a way that words struggle to fully capture. By the third failure, the people around you have quietly shifted. You can feel it before anyone says anything. The encouragement that used to come freely now arrives with a slight hesitation. The investors who once leaned forward in their chairs begin leaning back. The friends who once celebrated your ambition begin offering you what they call realistic advice, which is really just a polished way of suggesting that perhaps it is time to stop. Even the ones who love you most begin to wonder, in the private corners of their minds, whether they are watching determination or delusion. And then there is the internal battle, which is far more brutal than anything happening on the outside. Because by the third collapse, self-doubt doesn't knock anymore. It walks straight through the front door. It sits across from you at the table. It speaks to you in your own voice, using your own memories as ammunition. It reminds you of every resource spent, every relationship strained, every moment of certainty that turned out to be premature. The third failure doesn't just challenge your strategy, it challenges your identity. It reaches into the deepest part of who you believe yourself to be and begins pulling at the threads. This man sat in that darkness. He did not pretend it wasn't heavy. He did not pretend it wasn't heavy. He did not manufacture some superhuman courage that made the weight disappear. He felt every ounce of it. The exhaustion, the embarrassment, the very real possibility that everyone questioning him might actually be right. That night was not a highlight reel moment. There were no cameras, no applause, no audience witnessing his resilience. It was just a man, alone with the wreckage of a third dream, making a decision in the dark that the world would only come to appreciate years later in the light. And that is precisely what makes that night the most important chapter in his entire story, not the $1 billion that followed. There is a question that follows failure like a shadow, and if you are not careful, it will answer itself before you even realize it has spoken. The question is not asked out loud. It does not arrive in a single moment. It seeps in gradually, quietly, through the cracks that disappointment leaves behind. And the question is this: if I keep failing, does that make me a failure? For most people, the answer they arrive at is yes. Not because they are weak, not because they lack intelligence or drive, but because they have made a deeply human mistake. They have allowed their results to write their identity. They have handed the pen of self-definition over to circumstances, to outcomes, to the cold and often indifferent verdict of the market, the investor, the moment. And once your identity becomes a reflection of your results, you are no longer the author of your story. You are merely a character being written by events beyond your control. This man understood something that took most people a lifetime to learn, and he understood it in the middle of his suffering, which is the hardest place to hold on to any truth. He understood that what he did and who he was were two entirely separate conversations. His ventures had failed, his bank account had suffered, his reputation had taken damage that would have permanently paralyzed someone with a more fragile sense of self. But his identity, his core belief in what he was capable of, in what he was ultimately moving toward, that remained untouched. Not because life hadn't tried to reach it. It had. But because he had built his sense of self on something far deeper than his most recent result. This is not a small distinction. This is everything. Because the moment you internalize failure as identity, you stop making decisions from a place of possibility and begin making them from a place of protection. You shrink. You hedge. You choose safe over significant. You begin managing your life rather than building it. But when you hold your identity separate from your outcomes, when you can look at a collapsed venture and say that failed, but I am not a failure. You preserve the most important asset you will ever own, your belief in your own potential. He failed 3 times, and 3 times he walked back into the world with his self-concept intact. Not arrogant, not delusional, but deeply, quietly, unshakably convinced that his story was not finished being written. That conviction is not something the market gave him, and it was not something the market could take away. We live in a world that is obsessed with the moment of arrival. We celebrate the launch, the milestone, the announcement, the headline. We fill auditoriums for the success story. We share the highlight, the trophy, the transformation photo, the before and after. Social media has turned achievement into a performance, and somewhere in that performance we have collectively forgotten something profoundly important. That everything worth celebrating was first built in a place where nobody was watching. Resilience is not a public act. It never has been. It is one of the most private, unglamorous, deeply personal processes a human being can move through. It happens in the early morning hours before the rest of the world is awake. It happens in the journal entry that nobody will ever read. It happens in the conversation a person has with themselves when the silence becomes unbearable and the easiest option is sitting right there within reach. It happens in the decision to make one more call, write one more plan, believe one more time, not because the outcome is guaranteed, but because something on the inside refuses to accept the alternative. Nobody saw what this man carried between his failures. Nobody witnessed the mornings he had to rebuild his own motivation from nothing, starting with whatever small fragment of belief had survived the night before. Nobody sat with him through the humiliation of dismantling what he had publicly declared would succeed. Nobody counted the number of times he revised, reconsidered, and restarted. Not with fanfare, not with an audience, but with nothing more than a quiet and stubborn commitment to keep moving forward in whatever direction was still available to him. The world saw none of that, and then, when the breakthrough finally came, when the years of invisible labor compressed into a moment the outside world could finally recognize and measure, suddenly everyone had a front row seat. Suddenly his story became shareable, his journey became worth mentioning, his name became worth mentioning, but the people celebrating the result had no frame of reference for the process. They saw the destination without ever having to sit with the distance. This is why so many people become discouraged when their own resilience goes unrecognized. They are doing the work in private and measuring their progress against someone else's public result. They compare their behind the scenes to someone else's highlight reel and conclude that they must be doing something wrong. But the truth this man's journey teaches us is that the invisibility of your struggle is not a sign that it doesn't count. It is simply confirmation that you are in the exact season where the most important work of your life is being done. We have enough people in the world who are merely surviving, enough people who tried once, got bruised, and quietly negotiated a smaller life for themselves. A life built around the avoidance of pain rather than the pursuit of purpose. Enough people who took their dream, folded it carefully, placed it somewhere safe, and told themselves they would return to it someday, knowing in the deepest part of themselves that someday was never coming. The world is not short of people who gave up. What the world is desperately, urgently short of are people who refuse to be finished. And that refusal is not a personality trait. It is not something you are simply born with, like eye color or bone structure. It is a decision, a daily, deliberate, sometimes agonizing decision that has to be made in the moments when every logical argument is pointing in the opposite direction. It has to be made when the numbers don't work, when the support has dried up, when the version of yourself that once burned with certainty is standing in the mirror looking tired and uncertain and quietly asking whether any of this was ever worth it. This man's story matters beyond its entertainment value, beyond the remarkable financial milestone that punctuates its ending. It matters because it is a blueprint, not a blueprint for his specific industry or his specific strategy. Those details belong to his context, his era, his particular set of circumstances. The blueprint I am speaking of is architectural at a deeper level. It is a blueprint for how a human being navigates repeated devastation without losing the thread of who they are and where they are going. It is a map for moving through failure without being consumed by it. And blueprints, unlike inspiration, are actually useful. Because inspiration fades. You have felt it before. That electric feeling in a room like this one, the conviction that rises in your chest when someone else's story briefly makes you feel like anything is possible. And then Monday comes, and the inbox fills up, and the resistance returns, and the feeling is gone before you ever had the chance to build anything with it. But a blueprint stays, a principle stays, a reframed understanding of what failure actually means, what identity actually requires, and what resilience actually looks like in practice, that stays with you long after the applause dies down. That is what this man's story offers every single person in this room today. Not just a reason to feel something in this moment, but a reason to do something differently tomorrow, and the day after, and every day that follows, when the world once again tries to convince you that being finished is the only reasonable option left.